Just refer to my quote. I do believe that public health has been underfunded for decades. I do believe that we don't spend enough money on prevention, and that would include preparedness. So I stand by that statement, but I also understand that the National Emergency Stockpile was actually never meant to accumulate personal protective equipment, but rather other kinds of treatments for all kinds of biological events.
That was Justin Trudeau's Health Minister Patty Hajdu responding to a question about the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile. Hajdu is part of the Trudeau government's revision of history that tries to claim that, well, the stockpile was never meant to help out in terms of a pandemic. It was never supposed to hold personal protective equipment, and yet that is exactly what it was mandated to do. After SARS, it was part of the reason for the creation of Public Health Agency of Canada. It was being ready for the next pandemic. Now that they've been caught flat-footed, they're changing history, and they're trying to say this was never the deal. I'm going to play you a very long clip in a moment. It is of New Democrat MP Matthew Green from Hamilton asking Dr. Theresa Tam, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, about the stockpile and the fact that it was so low. In fact, the stockpile that was able to offer up to the provinces 200,000 N95 masks without running short during the H1N1 pandemic didn't even have 100,000 N95 masks in their possession before this pandemic started. They decided that it wasn't worth keeping that type of product on hand in case of an emergency. So they let it lapse. They let it expire. They shut down warehouses. They, to quote one official, reduced its footprint, and that left us flat-footed. Here is Green questioning Tam about that.
Answer, but I will go on. The Public Health Agency of Canada whistleblowers recently informed the Globe and Mail that PHAC did not have a target for the levels of personal protective equipment that it should maintain in the emergency stockpile. It didn't know the levels that the provinces and territory stockpile had, and it did not advise other levels of government about how much should be stockpiled. Dr. Tam, as the Chief Public Health Officer, were you aware of this situation prior to the COVID-19? And if not, why not?
In terms of personal protective equipment, that wasn't the main focus of the stockpile. It was to look at some very unique countermeasures like smallpox vaccines and other anthrax and other aspects. So in the pandemic preparedness construct, the province and territories also have their own stockpiles, and that they have their own personal protective equipment because they use that all the time. There was definitely a small amount. It wasn't a lot that can potentially help in a very specific situation, but that was not the main focus of MESS.
So there you have it. Tam also joining in the, well, it was never supposed to carry personal protective equipment. Yes, it was. It's on their very website that is part of their mandate. I've quoted it several times in columns. I've shown it to you in videos. That is part of their mandate. Now they're trying to claim that it's not because they forgot to place an order ahead of time. Green later on asked Tam about a report that she wrote years ago that said that in case of a pandemic, there should be a 16-week steady supply of personal protective equipment in a stockpile so that we could survive 2 waves of whatever virus or disease was making its way through the Canadian system. Tam, in her response, said that, well, this was just supposed to be something that was national and the provinces should have done it as well. And yet, the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile didn't even have enough equipment, enough PPE of all sorts on hand to last Ontario 1 week during this pandemic. So she's trying to tell us that the entire national stockpile was only supposed to look after one province for 1 week, but we were supposed to have 16 weeks of PPE on hand just in case? It doesn't make sense. I've spoken to past health ministers, past health officials, and they all say that none of what is being put forward by the Trudeau government now makes sense. I'll leave you with this. Green asked Tam at the end of his grilling of her whether she had ever informed Cabinet over the last 10 years that they were not funding the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile to an adequate amount, that they weren't funding it properly. Now, I've shown you in previous documents that the Conservatives had been funding health security to a degree of $78 million a year. The Liberals have cut that down to $51 million a year. That is a dramatic drop over 5 years. And the Liberals just say, well, it's the previous government. No, they've been in power for 5 years. So Green asked, have you ever told Cabinet that it's not funded properly? Tam wasn't allowed to answer. Health Minister Patty Hajdu jumped in and said, you know that conversations at Cabinet are confidential. Basically, she shut down the line of questioning. Canadians deserve answers on this because the federal government has failed them. They deserve to know what went wrong. And so far, the Trudeau government isn't willing to say.